So this next exploit is one that's won me a lot of big pots over the years and definitely something I've incorporated into my game. I use frequently and goes against kind of theory play or wouldn't be seen in a solver output just because it's not a sound strategy overall and it's not something we'd use against good players, capable players, type 1 players, but can be very profitable against weaker players, especially type 4, 5, and even 3 players. So this is a very specific situation. So anytime we're talking about exploitative plays and when they come up, I want to give you guys kind of triggers or checkpoints that will kind of trigger something in your brain that you are entering this situation and the exploit is possible. And then we're going to look at a couple examples. So the kind of 5 triggers I have here for this exploit. First off, we're going to be out of position always. We're playing out of position and we're going to be playing against an opponent who has shown strength and very likely has a strong one pair hand. So kind of there's a lot of different ways to deduce that. Could be a player who doesn't 3-bet very often, kind of only 3-betting for value. A recreational player who's kind of giving you some sizing tells. Maybe they opened a big pre-flop and they bet big on the flop. Information like that. So kind of making an assumption that our opponent likely has a strong hand. And this will be the second trigger. It's going to be either a 3-bet pot or a single raise pot, usually somewhere in the 50 to 100 big blind range. Less important than the big blind depth is really the SPR. So the stacked to par ratio on the turn, usually somewhere in the 3 to 7 category when I'm looking at making this play. This will be a lot easier to see when we look at the example. 3, we're playing against an opponent unlikely to run a multi-street bluff on the turn and river. So this will be important later when talking about like why this play is okay. The idea that we don't really need to protect our range because we don't expect this villain to bluff us on the turn and river. He's playing pretty honestly with the value of his hand. Number 4, our opponent does not read hands particularly well and or is very attached to the absolute strength of his hand. And absolute strength of his hand being defined as I have like aces and I feel strong that I have top pair aces, and not really thinking relative strength of the hand. Well, a card came on the turn where now I lose to more combos and I lose to 2 pair and straights and flushes. More concerned with just their hand and the strength of it. 5, and the last trigger is this almost always happens when we get a dynamic turn in which villain may choose to pot control and check back. So that's kind of the crux of this exploit is we're able to do this in spots where villain may check back if we check, but is likely or almost certain to put more money in if we do lead and bet. So that's kind of the basis or the triggers for our play. So I want to show you guys an example and then we'll talk a little bit more about the theory here. But this hand happened at LAPC 10K. It's actually the year I got third place, so I think this was 2019. Early in the tournament, this was day 1. Big blind 300. I was playing about 40K. Opened Jack 8 of diamonds in the hijack. Good player called in the cutoff and a type 4 loose recreational 3-bet the button to 2K. And I made a very loose call here for 2 reasons. One, the idea that I'd like to play a 3-bet pot against a weaker player at over 100 big blinds deep. 2, this 3-bet was improperly sized, so kind of this 2.5x sizing on a squeeze gives me a better price than I should get, where I think if he had 3-bet to 4K or 3,500 or something, I probably wouldn't be calling. And always think about, too, with sizing these 3-bets, and if you are on the button on the spot, not only do you have to think about the immediate price you're giving the opponent, but also the SPR you're going to be playing post-flop, where as the SPR gets lower, I'm less and less likely to play these sorts of hands as I feel like I have a bigger post-flop edge the deeper we're playing. So if you were to 3-bet to 4K and I were to call, now all of a sudden there's 9K in the pot and I'm playing 31K, which is kind of a 3-to-1 SPR, where when he 3-bets to 2K, now there's 5K in the pot and I'm playing 35, it's 7-to-1. So it's kind of a pretty big difference just from this small sizing mistake that the player makes here. So I call the 3-bet with Jack 8 suited. The reg in between actually folds. And 3-4-8, 2 diamonds on the flop. I check, button bets 3K. And hadn't seen this player 3-bet a lot, so I wasn't necessarily... I'd say I was weighting this player more towards value hands with this line. 3K doesn't tell us too much about, he definitely has aces or kings. So there are some considerations we can make. Obviously, we crushed this flop, but this was a freeze out tournament. So Jack 8 of diamonds, although we have good equity versus almost anything on 3, 4, 8, 2 diamonds, I'm going to play as a pure call just because I really do not want to get in a situation where I check raise this flop, all the money goes in, and I'm in sort of a flip situation against aces or kings. It's not really what I'm looking to do in this type of tournament, this kind of big field main event freeze out. So I take the more passive line here and I just call, knowing that I have this kind of exploit trick in my bag if necessary. And we do get the diamond on the turn after a check call. So now 11.5K in the pot. Button is playing 35K. So pretty common that a villain might check back and overpair here for pot control with or without a diamond. Bit concerning. Flushes get there. Maybe I have tens, things like that. But often, and kind of this is the point of this exploit, although they may check back and pot control, they're not really willing to fold to the lead. And it's important too that you use a bigger size here, I think, just to kind of make sure that the money gets in and targeting these types of players who are unable to fold one pair in these types of situations. So what happens here was I lead 10K and Button actually shoved 35K, and I get it in versus kings with the king of diamonds and hold and double up. But looking back at the theory here and kind of thinking more about why this works and the logic behind it, comes down to our villain being unable to fold good one pair hands in these spots. And we aren't really concerned about protecting our check call range as we would against a type 1 player or a type 2 player who might be bluffing a lot pre-flop, might be bluffing on the flop, and might be setting up bluffs on the turn and river and kind of facing some multi-street aggression with weaker hands. We're not really worried about that because we're playing a more honest opponent who very likely has a good hand. The logic kind of hinges on these assumptions we're making. And a good kind of test, if you're not sure if your villain is a good type of opponent to run this play against, is think about how they will respond versus this lead if they have aces or if they have kings. And if it seems like the money will go in, and especially if the idea is they may shove a lot, then this is probably the type of opponent you'd like to make this play against. And as always, we're going to be putting ourselves in our opponent's shoes here, in villain's shoes here. And villain, although not thinking completely logically, how is he approaching this spot on the turn? Well, they're thinking the board got worse, the texture got worse, my hand is now more vulnerable. I need to get the money in immediately to protect against this big bet. And now I'm playing an even bigger pot with a vulnerable one pair hand. Where villains don't go the extra step in kind of hand reading here is thinking about my range splitting on the turn, where I went from check calling on 8-4-3 to now leading out on the flush completer. And because this is a teaching course and I'm speaking honestly, my turn lead range here contains only flushes and sets and hands that beat two kings. But villain kind of is unable to confidently make that distinction of where kings falls against my value range. So he kind of may convince himself, oh, some hands with the ace of diamonds, maybe some sevens with a diamond. I mean, who knows what they may not even be choosing hands like specifically, but kind of not making that distinction in relative hand strength and kind of identifying that versus my check range, he's almost always good, and versus my lead range, he's almost always dead. So not dead, but with this king of diamonds overcard, but in a very bad spot as the relative strength of his kings against my turn lead range is very weak. But that's a tough distinction for weaker players to make. And especially if you have the image of a player who might be bluffing or is an aggressive player, a lot of type 3, 4, and 5 players have a hard time folding overpairs in these spots. And it's really a huge opportunity because when we do miss this spot and we kind of allow villain to check back turn, we play a much smaller pot. And in tournaments, we kind of can't miss these opportunities when we make big hands against weak players to win all the money. I think that's kind of a huge concept here, which shows itself a lot in this particular exploit. So let's look at another example of this turn lead exploit and how we can use it even against professional players. And this hand coming from a WPT 10K event in California Gardens against a Type 3 player, Jared here, who we're playing 1K big blind, about 40 blinds effective, and Villain opens the button here for 2.5K. I defend big blind with Queen 9 offsuit. Jack 8-3 rainbow. I check, button bets 40% pot, and I think we can either call or raise here. I think versus this size, I probably lean more towards calling than raising. I think either would be okay with some frequency. Not really the point of this particular hand, but I call this time, and the turn we hit our straight here. So we make our queen high straight, dynamic turn, changes something, some two pairs get there, and 11K in the pot. Villain here now playing 35K-ish. I lead for 8K. Let's go through our checklist here and see if this qualifies as a spot where we want to use this exploit. And are we playing out of position versus an opponent who has shown strength, very likely has a strong one pair hand? This one is probably the closest where it's not certain. We are playing out of position. He may be strong, but just the fact that he opened the button and c-bet is not enough that he certainly has a strong one pair hand, but it is possible. Is it a SPR of 3 to 7 on the turn? 50 to 100 big blind range, no. SPR 3 to 7, yes. There's 11K in the pot. He's playing about 35. That's right in there. 3, pretty important. Are we playing against an opponent unlikely to run a multi-street bluff on the turn and river? I thought yes in this scenario, where on this Jack 10, 8, 3 turn, playing against the big blind, I thought Villain would probably check and take the free card with a lot of ace-king, ace-queen type hands that a solver may bluff with, or a strong player, loose player may bluff with. Maybe he bluffs with king-queen, which we block, but I didn't really see Villain kind of blasting off on the turn and river, which would be, if we're playing an opponent we think is going to bluff a lot, we would not like to make this turn lead as it splits our range, and now our check calling range would be much weaker. But this play kind of built on the idea that Villain is not going to bluff very often on the turn and river. Thus, let's try to get the money in versus the strong part of his range. The next kind of check on our thing. Our opponent does not read hands particularly well and or is very attached to the absolute strength of his hand. Again, not super clear. We don't know how well this Villain reads hands. He is a professional, but I think this one kind of more driven on the depth and the situation. The fact that we're playing 40 blinds deep, button versus big blind. The absolute strength of his hand here, even a hand like top pair good kicker, is very strong in this situation. Villain may be unwilling to fold this strong of a hand on the turn. Kind of fifth point, we get a dynamic turn, which Villain may choose to pot control and check back. Also, I think true here on this 10, playing against the big blind, completing a lot of straights and some two pair combos. This is definitely one Villain could pot control, although at 40 big blinds, I wouldn't knock him for getting all the money in here, just going bet either. So this one much less clear than the other one. We were playing against a recreational player who almost certainly had an overpair. This one a little murkier, but still willing to make this play, thinking our Villain is unable to fold good one pair hands and will be able to get the money in and kind of not risk letting him pot control this hand. So looking at the results here, I lead 8K and he shoves 35K with King Jack offsuit, and we get it in with him drawing dead here on the turn, which is nice. And like I said on the last time, kind of a good indicator of if this is a Villain you want to be making this play against is if they're shoving this turn. Because I think if we are in his shoes, I would guess call is going to be the primary line where we want to allow me to keep bluffing. And when I do bet and call this turn on a, I don't want to say dry texture, but there's no flush draws on this board. So not a ton to really shove and protect against here. So when he does shove and get called, he's going to be dead or drawing very thin. So I think kind of a, I don't want to say error, but something to think about when using this exploit is we want to use it against players who are kind of eager to just shove the money in on the turn when they have a strong one pair hand, which is exactly what happened here. All right, guys, we're going to look at one more example here of this turn lead exploit, and one where it's a little more unclear whether or not the conditions are satisfied to try to use this line and make this exploit. This hand was actually played very recently last week at a $2,700 main event in Maryland here. Playing against a type 4 opponent, loose recreational. We opened under the gun with Queen Jack of Spades to 1800 at 800 big blind, playing something like 60, 70 blinds deep. Middle position 3-bet to 5K, our type 4 player. We call, I think, pretty pure call here. Not much else we're going to do in this scenario. Now 12K in the middle, and it comes Queen 8-7 rainbow. I check, middle position bets 3K quarter pot, and I call. And I turn 2 pair here on the Jack of Diamonds. And noteworthy too that this is a card that completes 10-9 suited as well. So kind of completing that open ender, pretty relevant here because it increases the chances he might pot control and check back this turn with hands we'd like to get more money in against, like aces, kings, ace, queen. So definitely relevant in these scenarios where if this was, say, a queen 3-2 flop and the turn was a jack, I would be slightly less likely to take this line and lead because villain might be more likely to continue betting for value with aces and kings, where this Jack of Diamonds a lot scarier in his eyes. And we're always kind of weighing these things. How often is he going to pot control and check back? How often is he going to get all the money in versus my lead when he does have these hands that might check back? And also, too, so we're kind of going through our triggers here. We have this kind of checklist. We're playing out of position against an opponent who has shown strength, likely has a strong one pair hand. This situation is a little murkier because he is a loose recreational player and does not blast the flop. We just kind of face this quarter pot bet on the flop, which doesn't scream aces or kings to me. So there is this chance that he's still possibly bluffing with something like ace king or ace 10, some hands like that on the flop, maybe even tens, something like that. Kind of important to weigh that kind of logic against what I think is our number 3 trigger point, which is how often is he going to run a multi-street bluff here? And that's something that on this kind of dynamic turn, which completes some 2 pairs, completes the open ender, I find it pretty unlikely that this player is going to continue bluffing with a hand like ace king, ace 10, kind of ace x suited, king 10, any kind of combo draw, or any hand he might be 3-betting that wants to bet the flop. I find it unlikely he's going to run some multi-street bluff on the turn and river with this texture now. So that kind of leads me to want to take this line. And again, you're weighing those 3 things. How often is he going to bluff? How strong is he? How likely is he to get in all of the money on the turn with a worse hand? That's a very important one. And kind of thinking, like our logic here, what would villain do versus a 2/3 pot lead on the turn with aces, with kings, with ace king, with ace queen here? If the answer is shove, then our line is probably pretty good, especially if we don't expect him to be bluffing a lot otherwise. So I lead the turn here for 11K, and he shoves for 45K, and we get it in versus ace queen and hold and catch a big double early in this event.